So, welcome. I am Michael Chidester. Today we're going to talk about the art of fencing of Johannes Liechtenauer. Here's sort of our agenda for today. We're going to do a little bit of introduction. We're going to talk about Liechtenauer and the Zettel, or record. We're going to talk about Liechtenauer's tradition, how it works, we're going to very slightly dip our toe into the history. I don't have a lot to say that's going to be relevant to everything else that I talk about later. So we're not going to go deeply into that. We're going to talk about glosses and we're going to talk about lessons. We're going to go into the question of techniques versus martial arts systems. And then I'm going to go off on a speculative tangent and I'm going to ask some questions and posit some answers about what Liechtenauer's system is. And then we'll go into conclusions and questions and you all can challenge my assertions and tell me that I'm wrong about everything. And ideally, we're going to do that in the next 70 minutes or so because this camera is going to run out of memory card at about that point. All right, so the drill, for those of you who weren't at our earlier lectures, is I'm on microphone, so they can't hear any of you when they're watching this video. So if you have a question, you can shout it out, but I'll have to repeat it or ignore it, so it enters the record. For the most part, please save questions for the end. If you have something burning that you feel will contribute to the conversation, interrupt me. That's fine, I'm used to it. All right, basic ideas. Wow, this projector is kind of washed out, isn't it? Okay, well this is a very pretty picture that doesn't look like it right now. Primarily, when we study Liechtenauer and other German styles, we're talking about what are called Fechtbücher, right? Or fencing books, fencing manuals. This is an example of a fencing manual, which a lot of you may recognize. This is the Gladiatoria that's currently in New Haven, Connecticut. It's sort of an archetype of what a fencing manual might look like. Here's another one. It's the copy of Fiore, which is in the Morgan Library in New York City, which really doesn't come through on this projector at all, does it? Ouch. All right, so the pretty pictures portion of this lecture may not be quite as pretty as I'm used to. Maybe we can combine this video with some better slides at some point with your digital magic. Here's another one. This is the Talhofer in New York City at the Met. What these things have in common is they have illustrations which show us a technique. They have words which ideally explain the technique, although in this case with Talhofer we can see immediately that the explanation is not very long, and I'll tell you is not very clear either. And between those two things, we sort of try to extract what the master was teaching, right? However, it's often not this clear cut, and some of the most important texts for Liechtenauer are what we call Hausbücher. This is the manuscript 3227A in Nuremberg. It's one of the oldest Liechtenauer texts, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit in this lecture. Hausbuch means commonplace book, or at least that's what we called the same thing in English. It's not a direct translation. It obviously means house book, literally. And this is basically a medieval or early modern scrapbook. It's a text that someone would keep and they would just copy down interesting things for their personal reference later. So it's not a structured book. They often weren't planned in advance. They just sort of accumulated information. And some of our best fencing instructions come from books like this or bizarre compilations of texts that are made after the fact. This is a text from 1539 that's credited, or at least part of it, to a Hans Madel, who we'll talk about later. But it's actually 4 different treatises that were bound together by Paulus Hector Meyer in the 1540s, including records from the Marksbruder Fencing Guild and a collection of Dutch prints of naked fencers, or mostly naked. So there's a lot of different kinds of texts that we consult to learn about Liechtenauer, and putting them together is sort of the big task of HEMA reconstruction, obviously. That's all the introduction I'm going to give you. If you want to see more of this stuff, go to Liechtenauer, which hopefully you've all heard of. It's a little project I've been working on for a little while now. So, Johannes Liechtenauer is this guy over here, maybe, or at least that's a picture that we presume to be him in a manuscript from his tradition. The only thing that we know about him biographically comes from manuscript 3227A, which says essentially that Master Liechtenauer learned the entire art of fencing, although he didn't invent it himself. Rather, he traveled through many lands and sought the legitimate and truthful art for the sake of experiencing and knowing it. Right? Very kung fu in this description. Other fencing masters give similar descriptions of themselves, like Fiore de Liberi and also Martin Seiber kind of repeat this. Well, the other thing that we know, oh, that slide's not quite yet. So this was not written by Liechtenauer. We don't have any writings from him. All we have are people writing about him, people recording what he taught. We don't really know if he ever existed, although he probably did, because we actually have quite a lot of information about folk heroes that didn't exist. So, I don't know. I feel like if he was really a folk image, he might have been listed in the lists of folk heroes. So, we don't even know when he lived. The date that people often give is in the late 14th century, and that's based on this calendar in 3227A, which runs from 1390 to 1495. So everyone says if it starts in 1390, it must have been written in 1389. Therefore, Liechtenauer was before 1389, which sounds like flimsy reasoning to me. I'm going to posit that the very first date in the book is when Nicholas Paul put his print mark on it in 1494. Therefore, that calendar was a past calendar, and it was written in 1495. I don't know. This is all just hand-waving. We have no idea when this manuscript was made. It was made sometime in the 14th or 15th century. That's the best we can say. Probably early 15th, plus or minus 30 years. Not great. T, why aren't you attending my lecture? Okay, the other thing we know about Liechtenauer is this description written at the beginning of a few of the glosses, which says that Liechtenauer wrote his art in obscure and cryptic words so that not everyone could grasp and understand it on account of frivolous masters who make the art trivial. But the same obscure and cryptic words of his Zettel are explained in the glosses so that someone who knows how to fight may actually understand them. So now we have two facts. He traveled widely to learn fencing, and then he wrote fencing in the most cryptic and hard to understand way possible, so no one else could learn it if he didn't want them to. The two earliest copies of this record, the German word is Zettel, which actually means list or like scrap of paper. Basically, anytime you write something down, it could be a Zettel. Sometimes we translate that as recital because it kind of sounds like Zettel, but really, it's just sort of a throwaway commonplace word in German. And I translate it as record because basically it means that he wrote something down. The earliest thing that we have is from the 1420s, 1418 to 28, which is this one on the right. My right, your left, rather, which does not mention Liechtenauer. It has most of his verses, but in a different order than Liechtenauer's own students give, and it attributes it to a certain Magister Berenger. The earliest copy that we have that mentions Liechtenauer is this one from the 1440s. Daniel Jacquet gives 1448 as his best guess of a date. It's often given as 1443. This was at least associated with Hans Talhofer. There are also many other copies, most of which are anonymous. This one from the 1460s is in a manuscript in Wolfenbüttel, which is written in Low German and doesn't mention Liechtenauer and has some extra verses. Hans Lecküchner took a bunch of Liechtenauer's poems and jumbled them together to describe Messer fencing in the 1470s and 80s. Peter FAULKNER was a captain of the Marksbrüder, and in the 1490s, he recorded both the strange version of Liechtenauer's longsword verse and also Lecküchner's Messer verse separately. So the actual status of this poem seems to be less clear than we'd like. We can't even be certain that Liechtenauer originally wrote it, although his is the name that's most often associated with it. So that's what I'll go with. It covers fencing with the long and short sword, and this is a drum I like to beat a lot because it's a mistake that I hate in HEMA nomenclature, but we're stuck with, which is the idea that a two-handed sword is properly called a long sword. The only time in any of the 15th century fencing manuals that we have this word longsword used, it is when Liechtenauer describes the distinction between fencing with the sword with two hands on the grip, which he calls longsword fencing, or the art of the longsword, versus fencing with one hand on the grip and one hand on the blade, which he calls short sword fencing, or the art of the short sword. We could just as easily render this as the extended sword versus the withdrawn sword, but because the gloss that everyone studies says, here begins the art of the longsword is the name that we use. Probably forever. Curiously, there is one play that actually emphasizes this distinction, and Tiku was the one who first pointed this out to me, where the only time he uses longsword and short sword in the same paragraph. This is from the DANZIG gloss that we'll get to later, and it says, note when you ride to his left side with the short sword, if he then hews above to your head and parry between your hands, and in the parry, grab your sword's pommel with the left hand and strike him with a free overhew from the long sword to the head. So it's a transition from short sword to long sword, and that's the only time that the phrase long sword appears inside the gloss on a technical instruction. Pretty cool. Also, note the seditious grabbing of the pommel here, which flies in the face of the only other instruction about the pommel that we have in 3227A, which says don't grab it. So obviously things are complicated when it comes to pommels. So the armored and mounted sections of Liechtenauer's verse cover what we recognize as the sequence of a judicial duel, beginning on horseback with spear fighting, fencing with swords, grappling on horseback. There's some dismounted plays with spear and sword. One person is on horse and the other is not. Then we get into foot combat with, these are really hard to see, aren't they? With fencing with the two-handed swords in various ways, dagger fighting, grappling, fighting on the ground, also, murder and bloody stuff. And then once you've killed your opponent, then they steal his clothes and put him in a body bag. And then you kneel and thank Jesus. This is from, that's how judicial duels work, right? Yeah, exactly. And Hans Talhofer looks on proudly, holding your weapons. Those are, the first several are from Paulus Cal in Vienna. Those last four with the nice gore and murder stuff are from Hans Talhofer, obviously, who's the best at gore. But of course, nobody cares about armored stuff, so we're not going to talk about this much more. Well, okay, a few people care about armored stuff, but it is very expensive and hard to train because you have to buy armor and, feed a horse and so on. So it is something that, as we know from history, only people with lots of money can really afford to do. So in HEMA, the stuff that requires less gear tends to be more popular, except wrestling. So the unarmored portion of Liechtenauer's art is on using the sword in two hands, as I said, and it's divided into 17 Hauptstücke, or chief techniques. This is how they're first introduced. Rathhew curved cross has squinter with parter, fool displaces, racing after, overrun, set the cut, change through, jerk back, run through, slice away, press the hands, hang with exposures, strike, catch, sweep, thrust with blows. That's pretty clear, right? This is from the Dresden manuscript that has Ringex gloss in it. And then he goes on, Liechtenauer goes on to explain with these things. Whoever overhews you, Rathhew threatens him with the point. If he becomes aware of it, take off above without danger. Be strong against, wind stab. If he sees, then take it down, etc. That's pretty clear, right? Obviously not. If this was all we had from Liechtenauer, then all of us would be Fiorists today because this is not enough to reconstruct a martial art. There are people today, after decades of study of other Liechtenauer texts, who look at this and can try to interpret it on its own terms, but only because of an immense foundation of Liechtenauer knowledge. If we were looking at this for the first time, it would mean nothing to us. Luckily, that's not the state that we're in. There were many masters after Liechtenauer who tried to expound this more clearly, beginning with a group called the Gesellschaft Liechtenauers, or the Fellowship of Liechtenauer, recorded by Paulus Cal in 1470. Consists of 16 masters plus Liechtenauer. However, most of these we don't actually know very much about. The names in red we have fencing manuals from. The others are mysteries to us. Like we know that Jakob Lignitzer was Andre Lignitzer's brother, but not anything that he did. We can surmise that Peter Wildegens von Glatz was from Glatz, but that's about it. Dietrich, the dagger fighter of Braunschweig, might have been a dagger fighter. We don't really know much about these masters. Hopefully, there are writings from them, and they're out there somewhere waiting for us in libraries, but no hint of them has surfaced yet. So we're left with these 6 names: Hans Liechtenauer, Peter von Danzig zum Ingolstadt, André Lignitzer, Sigmund Ringek, Martin Hunsfeld, and Ott Jude. What we can surmise from that list is they actually come from a fairly large geographical area. The places in their names are from all across what is today various Eastern European countries and Eastern Germany. Austria, Czech Republic, Poland, East Germany, you know, the entire, everything beyond the Iron Curtain, more or less, was where this tradition seemed to have originated. But that's about all we can say. And here I'm going to take a brief segue to talk about timelines again, because it's something that I care about. And it really needs to be solved before we can really understand some of the context of these arts. So I showed you this slide with some random dates that don't really tell us much of a story. If we look at those masters on that list, we get a much better story. And other masters who record Liechtenauer's art. So 1448, Talhofer records the Zettel in a fencing manuscript that also includes the writings of Ott Jude, where he is not listed as being deceased. In 1452, Ott Jude is now deceased. He's given the, may God have mercy on him, benediction after his name in 1452, as are André Lignitzer and Martin Hunsfeld, whereas Peter von Danzig seems to still be alive. And that's the only copy of his treatise that we have, so we don't know when he might have died. A second treatise from the 1450s, same thing, most of the same contents, and also the same people being deceased. Sigmund Ringek mentions serving at Duke Albrecht of Bavaria. Albrecht III reigned from 1438 to 1460, which might put Ringek in this same window. 1459, Talhofer is still writing. He records Liechtenauer's Zettel again. 1470, Paulus Cal records the Gesellschaft Liechtenauer list that I showed you in 3 different manuscripts. 1474 is the first reference to the Marxbruder Fencing Guild in any record that we found. And they're the ones who would take Liechtenauer's art to the world and spread it all around the Holy Roman Empire as the standard fencing system. 1478 to 82, Hans Leukner's Kunst Messerfechtens is written in at least 3 manuscripts. And then in the 1480s, the Marxbrüder are officially chartered and given a monopoly on making fencing masters, which is sort of off the edge of this timeline. But everything continues from there in a nice, tightly packed group. So this timeline sort of shows a logical progression of information being disseminated, of masters retiring and recording their works, and really giving us their instructions. What do those consist of? Of these 6 masters, nearly all of them teach armored fencing, among other weapons, including Hans Pegnitzer, who we don't have a treatise from, but we do have one technique of poleaxe from in the Rostock manuscript, and Paulus Cal, who recorded the list, who also covers armored fencing. Ott Jude is the one outlier, but because he teaches a grappling system, that could also be argued to be armor applicable, because obviously grappling is a key skill in armor. Also, of these, 3 of them who we know biographical information about, Ringek, Hans Stettner, von Mornschein, and Paulus Cal, were all military officers who served various nobles. Which suggests to me that perhaps the reason for this society to exist was some kind of military conflict, and there was one huge one in this void right before all these dates begin appearing, which were the Hussite Wars, in which we know that mercenaries and knights would band together in societies called Gesellschaften and swear to each other to protect each other and go off and murder heretics in Eastern Europe. So a person named Liechtenauer might very well organize a bunch of fighting men to go off and fight the heretics, and they might just call that Gesellschaft after the leader of the group, named Liechtenauer. Possible. We don't really know. This is all speculation. This is something that Jens Peter Kleinau and I have kicked around lots of times as a potential but far from proven explanation for any of this. It does beg the question of why we would have this outlier. And here we go back to, again, the date of this manuscript. 1389 violates this entire neat cluster. History is not always tidy. That doesn't mean it's wrong. There are many reasons why one person might record an art 80 years earlier than anybody else. For example, if there were vows of secrecy involved. However, the other contents of this commonplace book were treatises that tended to become common in the early 1400s and were quite rare and barely even existed in 1389. So a date in the 1420s or 30s would seem to satisfy the contents of this book better and bring us once again to a nice, tidy knot of dates. That doesn't really mean much in history, but it's something to think about. If it was written in the 1380s, we really have a hard time answering the question of why and how and for what reason it took so long for anybody else to write. That's about all I have to say about that. Let's talk about these. Now I'm going to try and blast through a really complicated technical piece of this lecture, which many of you have heard in the past, which is talking about what the glosses are and what's in them, because it's only somewhat important right now. As I said, we have 6 names here who are associated with fencing manuals. In 1985, Hans-Peter Hills put together this diagram trying to trace the patterns of copying of all of the different examples of these fencing manuals. And he created this nice spider web here. However, Hans-Peter Hills only knew of 55 German fencing manuals at that time. Currently, I know of about 110. So we're in a much better state knowledge-wise today than we were back then. And I've been working on trying to update some of this information. Wow, this looks like even less than it did on the actual slide. There's gray text in here that doesn't even show up at all. But trying to trace how the glosses are put together, because the glosses are what give us Liechtenauer's art. I know what you're thinking. Matt looks interested. Everyone else is thinking, oh God. Don't worry. It's actually not this complicated, because really there's only 6 glosses. And we're going to talk about these very briefly. Well, there's sort of 7, but we'll talk about why that one doesn't count as well. So when you look at this chart, all you really need to care about are these junction points, because these are the texts that we actually study. Everything else is just sort of more of a scholarly curiosity, which means we can simplify that chart down to this one. And from this, we see that there are 2 independent glosses, 2 descriptions of Liechtenauer's art that don't actually base themselves on anything else. And all of the other ones are tied together in ways that we're still trying to understand. And the original sources for them, in many cases, seem to be a mystery. So we'll look at this list, and we'll start by looking at the glosses of the 2 of these guys that actually wrote one, who are Peter von Danzig and Sigmund Ein Ringek. Peter von Danzig wrote one of these independent ones on the side. However, it's only short swords, which nobody cares about. But it was written in 1452, more or less. It has a single copy. It's a very interesting text because of how different it is from the other armored fencing texts. It talks about, it seems to show a lot more awareness of the fact that the fight is happening in a ring with rules, as opposed to the other ones, which are much more technical about how you're behaving, and not so much about what you're doing to interact with the situation. So he'll talk about driving your opponent out of the ring, for example, which is not a thing which, might be one of the victory conditions of your duel, but is not one of the things that you'd think of if you're learning a pure martial art, right? You could look at it as sportive, but again, a lot of these sportive events were also killing people. So what does sport even mean? So let's go from there over to Ringek. Ringek, sadly, does not exist in a currently complete text. Here are some of the texts that we know of that have part of Ringek's treatise. Ringek, we know, actually covered all 3 parts of Liechtenauer's art, but is quite fragmented. So the way we have to read Ringek is by overlapping all of these manuscripts and looking at them together to try to derive what the original text looks like. The two best copies would be the Glasgow and the ROSTOCK copies, which give us more information about how the thing was constructed and have the most content. The Glasgow copy is the only illustrated one, but the ROSTOCK confirms that the original was also illustrated. Sadly, these two are not nearly as popular as the copy in Dresden, which is the one that's been translated many times in published form. This one is very incomplete and fragmentary. It's missing a lot of content. The mounted section stops halfway through, and many of the unarmored longsword plays have been removed. The armored longsword's pretty good, though. And there's also a copy in the manuscript of Albrecht Dürer of just the short sword, which, yes, that Albrecht Dürer, who some of you have probably heard of for his artistic achievements, also made a fencing manual, which has pretty pictures, but more importantly, well, they're not very pretty on this projector, but more importantly, has about 50 pages of text at the back with a lot of interesting manuscript contents that raise more questions than they answer. So that's Ringek, a very important text. If T were in this room, he would agree wholeheartedly. And also one of the very first Liechtenauer texts to ever be exploited by the HEMA community. It was published in 1965 by Martin Weerschein. 67? 65. And so we've been looking at this one for longer than anything else, except maybe Talhofer. The other branch of this first fork is these two manuscripts, which we call Pseudo-Peter von Danzig, which is a scholarly way of saying not Peter von Danzig. But he's the guy who we, for many years, referred to as Peter von Danzig. And if you were talking about HEMA in the 90s and someone said Peter von Danzig, they probably weren't talking about that short sword manuscript or treatise. They were talking about the one that begins with these illustrations, which I'm sure you've all seen. And if you ever wondered why you haven't seen any other pictures from this book, it's because it only had 3 pictures. These two and the Liechtenauer on his throne. It is the only complete gloss where most of the copies that we have all of their contents in the right order, and it is, for that reason, many people's go-to source. However, we've more recently learned that it actually splits into 2 branches. And again, the one that everyone studies here on your left is, no, you're right, is the less interesting in some ways, whereas this one over here with the darker page and the bigger text is my personal favorite, which we tend to call Yud Lev for reasons that are not going to become apparent right now. So I call these branch A and branch B. That's never caught on. Yud Lev and Pseudo Danzig are what we use on Facebook these days. But the Yud Lev is the more common one. It exists in 13 copies across the 15th and 16th centuries. These are the 2 oldest ones from the 1450s and 1491. It's also the one that Paulus Hector Meyer copied and translated into Latin in the 1440s and 50s. Branch B, however, has pretty pictures. It's the one that's in Goliath, and therefore has all this excellent early 16th century Landsknecht clothing and gigantic swords. Also, interesting ethnic costumes, armored fencing. It's got all the great illustrations and most of the good Liechtenauer content as well. And I'll come back to the question of Yud Lev versus Pseudo-Peter von Danzig later. There are also 2 outliers that we don't really have good explanations for. One of them is in Paulus Kal's fencing manual of 1480, which appears to be a sort of intermediate copy that shares DNA with both the Yud Lev and the Pseudo Danzig versions. We're not sure where it came from, whether it's the source for both of those or just a sort of later compilation. Whereas the Antonius Rast manuscript, which was completed by Paulus Hector Meyer in 1553, is sort of this Frankenstein-esque abomination where it appears like paragraphs were just copied haphazardly from either one and also from Ringek. Possibly because Paulus Hector Meyer botched things when he was trying to turn Antonius Rast's notes into a different fencing manual. But 2 different texts from opposite ends of the Liechtenauer sort of timeline that don't match up to this gloss stemma. Someday we'll understand, I'm sure. Now, the other independent text would be this one, which is 3227A, which we call pseudo Hans Dobringer sometimes, pseudo Dobringer. It's an independent tradition, not dependent on the other glosses, very different in its contents, but tragically incomplete. Once upon a time, I would have stood up here and totally made fun of this for a few minutes because there's a lot to criticize about this text. It's not very clear. It's not very well written. It really needed an editor, but it contains some of the most important information about Liechtenauer's tradition of any single manuscript that we have. The approach is very different. He doesn't break things down into small, little digestible techniques for the most part. He tries to give you big picture information. And is not very good at it. However, I love this manuscript, and we're going to come back to this at the very end. It is very much a different sort of fresh take on Liechtenauer from the glosses we usually study. All right, and now we come to the bottom of this diagram. Hans Mädel von Salzburg was a fencing master in Salzburg who we have records of from 1501. In 1539, someone, probably one of his students, wrote down a gloss with his teachings. I think of this as the syncretic gloss because it really tries to take all the prior glosses and merge them together into a better teaching. So in many cases, it copies verbatim from Udlev or from Ringek, and mostly Ringek. But in other places, he abandons the text completely, tells you that it's wrong, and then goes into what Hans Mädel teaches instead. And best case scenario, he does both and tells you, here's the weird shit that Hans Mädel believes, but also other masters are teaching this thing, which is totally still legit. It's got illustrations, but they don't really go with the text very well. And like has become a trend in looking at glosses, it is incomplete. It stops right here with von dem Zucken, and the next page is a completely different source. So we'll never know what he had to say about Zucken or any of the later Hauptstücke, which is too bad because his approach is bizarre and interesting. And now we come to this guy, Lecküchner, like I said, sort of a seventh source, exists in two manuscripts that have his hand on them, and one other one probably that we don't currently have, covers quite a lot of interesting material, your typical sorts of binding and winding and grappling, and also stuff like parrying a master with your forearm or throwing your opponent into a sack as a carnival gag. So not really what Liechtenauer had in mind, probably. We have to wonder about all of his contents for that reason, and whether he was actually a legitimate fencing master. If we look at 3227A, how he describes the Leichmeister or the false masters, dance masters, however you want to translate that, what does he say? Say they have invented a new art, better and greater. Lecküchner does that. Give Liechtenauer's techniques new names. Check. Wide fencing around and parrying. Yes. Often do 2 or 3 strikes in place of a single one. Definitely. Deliver wide and long hews. He loves those. Lecküchner fits the bill. But, you know, who the hell was pseudo Hans Dobringer to criticize this guy? I'm not saying that that manuscript was written specifically to criticize Lecküchner, but, you know, 1495. It's the right time frame. If Jake Norwood were here, he might protest that none of these things is necessarily bad, and that would be correct. Like, there's no problem with delivering 2 or 3 strikes in place of one. It just is a really bad idea if you don't know how to do it well, and so on and so forth. So we could go around this circle forever. Martial artists trash-talking each other is a tradition as old as fighting, as we all know. So like I said, we have 6 glosses that we care about. And with them, we can revisit this question of Hauptstücke. How are we doing for time? All right. So, cryptic, mysterious text. We can then break apart into an actual understanding that he's describing 17 techniques. Amazing. Which are divided into 5 hidden strikes and 12 chief techniques by some writers. I'm not going to read them for you. We can take the obscure and cryptic words that Liechtenauer wrote and demystify them into actual technical instruction or what they mean. So in this case, that first couplet, we now have lots and lots of ideas about how it breaks over hews, is a simple peasant strike. When someone hews towards your head, then wrathfully hew with him with iron displacement, with the long edge, strongly from your shoulder, so on and so forth. Shoot the long point into his face or breast, thus do you set upon him, and then the other two as well. We can take these and combine them with our pictorial evidence and actually arrive at a pretty confident interpretation of what this mysterious verse might actually mean. Oh, he strikes high towards your head, so you strike onto his sword and stab him in the face or the chest. That middle picture totally has face stabbing. Take my word for it. I will publish these slides online so you can actually look at the pictures if that you're so inclined. This is the first images from the Clooney Effect book. The second one is from Paulus Cal, and the third one is from Goliath. And we get from this the idea that the Zettel is organized in a very specific way, beginning with general instructions, going through structured set plays, sort of like two-person kata, demonstrating various techniques, offering a tactical framework, technical glossary of all the plays that you already performed at the beginning, and a summary of the record where he indicates that all of fencing comes down to 24 windings. This is how I broke down the Liechtenauer tradition a few years ago. There are lots of different opinions on how to do this, and I don't even agree with this anymore, but it is a pretty good generic one. You could also look at it as taking the 3 sections of the Zornhaus section and projecting them onto the rest of the art, and how we have 4 pieces of Zufechten, 4 pieces of Krieg, and 4 pieces of winding. And this comes from Jess Finley. She has this excellent tree diagram, which is not in these slides, where everything is divided into groups of 4 and 5. Well, groups of 4 with a 5th member that's not one of the Hauptstück. As I said, the glosses help us understand these things, but they don't always agree with each other. And this is where things get interesting to me. We can start contrasting explanations and discover that even when a text appears to be based on the same source, there are discrepancies that make a difference. This is the Tverhau from PSEUDO-PETER von Danzig and from Judlev. The text in red on the left and on the right is the same. It gets moved around in the paragraph, which completely transforms how the technique is executed. This one idea, whether your opponent comes against you in Vom Tag before or after you prepare your Tverhau, actually changes quite a lot. Also, the insertion that you wait until your opponent steps toward you and then you step to the side, as opposed to trying to close distance, vastly changes the technique. So a few words here and there, within the realm of possible, of just maybe scribbled errors, but probably someone's intention, can transform the text and give us a different sense of how it works. And really, when we start playing this game, PSEUDO-PETER von Danzig loses out big time because it's almost always the least clear source when we go with a side-by-side view. Ringek and Judlev, despite being less complete, tend to have better information when they have information, which is very interesting. And not always true either. Let me just keep vacillating back and forth, right? So, here we have Pseudo-Danzig on the far side over there, Judlev in the middle, Ringek over here. This is the Scheitelhau. And now, everything is really different. We have one paragraph that jumps down to the very bottom here in 2 versions. You don't have to read all these words. Matt's going to read them anyways. I don't want you to read all these words, because really what I want you to look at is the shape of this gloss and see the fact that the distribution of text changes quite a lot between 3 versions that probably came from the same gloss originally. How 2 of them on the left side here are very heavy towards the beginning, whereas Ringek skips over most of the setup and goes into a much more detailed explanation of the later piece of the technique. And this is all bright blue and bright red on my slides, but here it looks kind of grayish, doesn't it? Oh well, technology. Like I said, I'll put these slides online so everyone can peruse this. So this brings me to a question of what makes a martial arts system? It's not techniques. I'll tell you that right up front. Any technique we can find in any system. So here's an example of something that's sort of iconic Fiore called the false point. It's one of his few named techniques, punta falsa. Do we have any Fiores in the room? Too bad. Not going to read this, but this technique actually appears all over the place, despite being an iconic Fiore technique, and it's not even executed the same way by different fencing masters who teach it. For Talhofer, it's a technique associated with the Schielhau, the squinter. For Ringek, it's a technique associated with Ansetzen, which is setting upon. And obviously for Fiore, it's a feinting technique that he does from the wide play in the third master of longsword. The same technique can fit into many different systems in different ways. To understand what a system is, we have to look farther afield. And likewise, the same technique can look very different from masters in the same system. This is the Absetzen as given by the early glosses versus the Absetzen of Joachim Meyer. And the green text is where it matches up, whereas the red text are differences. Beginning in a different guard, having a different conclusion to it. If we believe that Meyer is the same tradition as Liechtenauer, which I do believe, then we have to ask, well, we have to conclude that differences in technique execution also are not what make a system or make two systems differently. So if I ask, what is the core of Liechtenauer's system? And this is a question that I've been sitting with for a few years now because it troubles me that I didn't have an understanding of this. What makes Liechtenauer's Kunst des Fechtens a coherent system and different from anything else? I mean, you could argue it's not different, and it's not different in a lot of fundamental ways, but what makes it his? What was he bringing to the table? Now, the first place people go when I ask this question is they say 5 strikes. These are one, the Zornhof from Paulus Cal, and the other 4 strikes from the Cluny Fecht book. All right. But techniques, I'm already willing to discard out of hand. 5 strikes are just strikes. Everybody does strikes. They're mostly diagonal or horizontal cuts. They're not special. From there, people often say, okay, well then it's clearly 5 words. Oh, now we're going to get into the weird esotericism of Liechtenauer. Vor, nach, stark, schwach, and the sharp word indes, right? Before, after, strong, weak, within. However, these describe fencing. They don't create fencing. And you can look at any fight in any martial arts system and describe it in terms of before and after, strong and weak, or within. These are universals of fencing. They're not Liechtenauer. They're a way Liechtenauer describes fighting, not a way he instructs fighting. Does that make sense? Or so I'm going to argue here. You may disagree. So when I ask the question, here's another way of phrasing this question, which is, what is the essence of the art that a master holds in his head that can't be recorded in a book? We often say you can't learn fencing from a book. Well, we don't say it. We often yell at people who say that. But everybody else in the whole martial arts world tells us, you can't learn fencing from a book. What is the piece that doesn't go in the book? And again, I've had this conversation on Facebook, and the 5 words is something that comes up. Other sort of esoteric things related to Liechtenauer come up. I don't believe that. And in fact, the question I've been exploring for the past year or so, since sometime in 2017, was this sort of intangible piece, is it in the book? Obviously, there's something that a master has that he will use to turn a student into a fighter, that he will give them in this sort of body-to-body instruction. But can we find that? Here's another way of looking at it. We know quite a bit about Liechtenauer's techniques, but what does Liechtenauer's fight look like? Does Liechtenauer expect you to begin with square one and work through the place of the Zornhau, and then if that doesn't work, you back off and start your Krimpau decision tree? What is... I'm pretty sure we'd all agree, you don't go from lesson 1 to lesson 110 in order in a fight. So how does Liechtenauer actually want you to fight? And what does a student who learned the lessons in the glosses look like when he fights? or what should he look like? What did he look like in 1450? I'm raising these questions because I can't answer them, but I want everyone in this room, anybody who watches this video, to think about them and look for these answers, because I think it's something we don't talk about enough in the HEMA community, and it's one of the core questions that we need to be martial artists, especially to be martial arts instructors. So, I went looking for clues, and what I'm going to show you for the next few slides is not my ideas alone. Quite a lot of people in our part of the HEMA community have been looking at these same questions. Jess Finley gave me ideas, Corey Winslow, Christian Trosclair, Jake Norwood, Ben Michaels, various others have looked at these questions along with me, and we've been trading shit back and forth over the course of this year. The first place I went looking is this phrase. Because I had the question, how do I get from point A, looking at an opponent across the room, to actually beating him in a match? How do I begin? Wenn du mit dem Suffekten zu ihm kommst, when you come to him with the onset, is a phrase that occurs many times, 38 times in the glosses, especially the Danzig, Ringak, and Lev glosses, sorry. So what I did, I started looking for that, and I got quickly confused because of all the differences. So I took this text and I broke it down, or I compiled it into a single sort of super gloss that contains all of the specific instructions in all of the glosses. Where they agree and where they disagree, then I would have them separate. But tried to actually put together the puzzle into a single document I could consult. And so I have a gloss that looks more like this, where it's broken down, where it's single paragraphs that then begin with tactical instructions. What is he doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And other things. There's lots of colors. It's a very fun document to read. But this question then, where am I? Then I started asking this question. What does he tell me to do when I come to him in the onset? The place where I ended up pretty quickly is this paragraph in the Zornhau. On the 4 openings, the 4 exposures, the Vier Blosse. He says, whoever wishes to be a master of the sword, if he shall know how one shall search for the 4 exposures with the art. There are 2 ways, shooting in the long point with the racing after, or nachreisen, or secondly, with the 8 windings when one is bound on the sword. Therefore, you force the man, so he must displace you. This is interesting because of how often we misuse this phrase. I've been in so many frustrating discussions where I was so confused because everyone wants to know, how do you force the man so he must displace you when you're doing the normal HEMA fencing? And the answer everyone comes up with is, oh, we just suck and we're suicidal and therefore we can't be forced. And that's not true because he doesn't tell you that whenever you do any cool technique, the man is forced to displace. He says, when you shoot the long point, race after, or wind, he is forced to displace, and no other time. And then he connects it into the verse, set upon the 4 ends. So here we're getting into some interesting connections, or some interesting starting points to find connections. From there, I went to the very beginning of the gloss. The very first technical instruction he gives you, the first attack in the entire Liechtenauer corpus, is here. Hew near whatever you wish. No change comes into your shield. Toward the head, toward the body, do not admit to lighter hits. Remember, this is when you come toward him with your onset, okay? We know where we are, when we're coming to him with the Zufekten. Hew in therewith, near toward the head and toward the body, and remain with your point before his face. Therefore, you force him so that he must displace. All right, we've got 2 key phrases now in this paragraph. If he displaces with strength, lets the point go out from you on the side, give him a lighter hit on the arm, step backwards. Or if he drives high up with his arms, then strike him with a hew below at the body and step backward. All right, so when you do this, he's going to behave predictably because now he's forced to displace. And there's really only 2 things he can do. He can push your blade aside or he can push it up. I guess he could also push it down, but he doesn't cover that till much later. Okay, sorry. What does that mean? That we're constraining him. Why can't he change through? That's actually covered later on in the text. Come to know changing through. Where he tells you when you should change through and says, oh, actually, if he remains with the point before your face, do not change through, but remain on the sword and work therewith toward the nearest exposure. So he may not do exactly what he should be doing in seeking the opening. So we get it, the first time we get sort of the two opposite sides of the equation, where if you're going to hew near, you're doing it so he can't follow this decision tree in the changing through. Obviously, there's a third option. If he doesn't want to parry, then he has one other thing that's smart to do, which is wrathfully hew without parrying. And I can't tell you how many times I've had discussions about why the Zornhau doesn't include parrying. Well, when you recall that it's immediately after a discussion of what happens when your opponent parries, then you say, oh, wait, if he's hewing with the point before your face, and you do the exact same thing to him instead of parrying, that's when the fight starts getting interesting. And the entire Zornhau tree is built around how you respond to the person who's actually following the general instructions. The Zornhau verse has some interesting, and I realize, like, I need to have a slide that has like a corkboard set up with red thread going everywhere, because really, this rabbit hole, you can jump around the gloss forever finding connections like this. But the Zornhau includes this quatrain. I say to you truthfully, no man protects himself without danger. This is the only verse that appears, what does that mean? Okay, this is the only verse that appears in 2 sections in the entire Zettel. The other section is the long point. When we look at the long point, it gives you the opposite equation to the Zornhau. Every play of the Zornhau is reflected in the long point, but it gives you the counter to every play of the Zornhau in the long point Sprechfenster. And this is where I started saying, son of a bitch, what if everything is actually tied back to itself? And we're not just looking at a grab bag of techniques, but we're looking at an actual self-contained model of a fight. But what about racing after? I know a lot of my study has focused on what this long point game is because it's so interesting and it's been so little a part of my Liechtenauer training until this year. I've just never looked at it because it's at the end of the book, and who even reads that far, right? We all look at the 5 strikes as a model of how to fight and miss the bigger picture. But racing after, when we think about that, we look at this text in the gloss and we say, oh, clearly it's when he hews down from you hews downward to you from above, you void, and then you smack him. And that's racing after. And we tend to forget the fact that Ringek has 2 racings after, and the first one is nothing like that. What Ringek says is, notice when he yanks up the sword to strike and race after him, hit him toward the upper exposure before he descends with the strike, or fall with the long edge above him onto his arm. Or if he wants to thrust from you, note the moment he draws the sword to him and race after him and thrust him before he completes his thrust. So we're going after before, which is obviously the way we all think about the word after, right? And I believe that Ringek is not giving you a technique to practice here. He is giving you the definition of racing after and telling you that everything in this book that works this way is actually the racing after half of the equation. The other way that a master of the longsword strikes. What does that look like in practice? Well, if we take Yud Lev's approach to the Tverhau, which is my favorite piece of gloss right now, he says, when you go toward him with your onset, okay, we know where we are, we're at the beginning of the fight. If he then stands against you and holds his sword with arms outstretched over himself and waits on you, then notice when you come near to him, set the left foot forward and hold your sword with the flat on your right shoulder. If he then steps toward you and threatens to strike you, then come before him with your hew. You're not attacking a person who's turtled up in his guard. You're not attacking somebody who's momentarily passing through a position. This is somebody who's advancing toward you and entering striking distance before he strikes. This is, George Silver would have a lot to say about this. But if we were to take a page from Silver for a second, we could say what he's saying is, if your opponent gives you the right place, then you will strike in the time of the hand to counter him because he did not actually cover himself. So essentially, you're attacking into his preparation. And the instruction is not to step forward. He did that, and that's why he's going to die. Instead, you take a sneaky sidestep to give you a better angle, and you're going to attack at your same distance. There are many plays in the text where you can find this setup of your opponent enters distance but has not yet threatened you, and you have an instant where you can attack him safely because his attack will be slower than yours. And if you can preempt him when he's already given you distance, then you can attack with safety. And George Silver would smile down on you from his place in English hell. So from here we go to my big process map, which is not done yet. I confidently said in January that by April I could present this whole lecture at a symposium in Amherst, and got to about mid-April and said, fuck, I don't have this yet. And actually I've been building this lecture all year because this is a bigger and bigger puzzle the longer I look at it. This is not, I can't give you a sneaky, clever answer that solves all of these questions. And some of these slides I created this morning, and some of them I created 2 weeks ago for a lecture I gave, or 3 weeks ago in Seattle, and some of them came for Factual Frisbee. And I've been working on this and will keep working on this. And someday I will have a big process map that lays out all of the plays according to where their entrances and exits are. And it'll be cool and it'll be worthless for fighting, but maybe will help us all understand a little bit more of the theory. Because obviously fighting is not a flowchart. It's more of a physical activity. But what I can tell you right now is if we look at all the instances of beginning in the onset, there are 38 of them across Yud Lev, Pseudo-Peter von Danzig, and Sigmund Ringek. 19 of them are plays where you make a speaking window and shoot the point at your opponent. The other 19 are standing in a guard and giving an opening, and then as your opponent advances towards you, you preempt him with your racing after. The numbers 19 and 19 are not important. You could fudge this a few different ways and arrive at different numbers, but I have not found any of these plays that do not fit into this paradigm that he gives you in the 4 openings. All of the instructions on how to enter against your opponent or have him enter against you fall into this. Liechtenauer is actually very consistent in his advice, and so are his glossators. And now you ask, well, so if we look at them, the basic headings where these come up, speaking window and general instructions, the Zornhau, the Schielhau, displacement, Ansetzen, Oberlaufen, Durchwechsel, Zucken, Händedrücken, and Hängen. Racing after, all of the vier Versetzen can follow this model. Nachreisen, obviously, Absetzen and Durchlaufen fit in here. Although Durchlaufen is weird. But once wrestling gets involved, everything goes out the window, right? And then the winding is the piece of this puzzle I'm not entirely satisfied with, but I'll give it to you as a homework assignment. There's an interesting piece of text at the very, very end, second to last paragraph, and this is where I'm going to conclude, which says, you may not rightly drive the 8 windings except with stepping from both sides, right? Which we read and we say, okay, never wind without stepping. That's great advice. Do not do that. However, implicit in the same words would be never step without winding. And if you go through the text and look at when it tells you to step towards your opponent, as opposed to springing sideways, stepping towards your opponent is always done after a bind with a wind, because if you step towards your opponent and you're like the idiot who eats a Tverhau in the face, then Liechtenauer will be sad with you. Instead, the only safe way to enter your opponent's distance is with a long point, which we already know, or having already bound and then entering with the wind. And from here we come to the conclusion. Kiana, were you trying to leave? Okay. Okay, so this is the beginning of 3227A, the first paragraph. And I didn't begin this project expecting to agree with this book. This is back when I still hated it. What I discovered after having some of these ideas about what the glosses I like are teaching, I reread this because Christian Trasclair retranslated it and I was editing his translation. And I said, son of a bitch, like this is everything in this introduction. The difference is 3227A wants to give you the entire package in one explanation, whereas the other glosses want to break it up and teach it to you step by step. But if you read this, and this is your other homework assignment, and think, what is Liechtenauer if I don't do any of the 5 strikes? Maybe you can do the Zornhau. If I skip the vier Versetzen, every single thing in the introduction to 3227A will click into place, and you'll see Hauptstücke everywhere. It will suddenly look exactly like Liechtenauer's tactical model that you find in the rest of the text. And then you can add back in the 5 strikes as you wish once you actually grasp that. But the entire Vorschlag, Nachschlag paradigm is based on shooting the long point and winding to the kill. And it's beautiful. It's excellent. Further reading, look at Liechtenauer. We've got everything there. If you want to see 3 of these glosses lined up side by side, there's a PDF available from Hror, which lists, I think I pronounced that right, which lists all of them with some illustrations. By all of them, I mean the 3 that we had translated when I put this together. There is a forthcoming revised edition that will have all 5 glosses I talked to you about, plus some other scraps. That'll be coming out ideally next year, but it really will depend on when Corey and Christine and I can get all of our work done. And that's going to be, hopefully, the definitive work on the subject. But for now, this is a great resource to start looking at all the glosses side by side. Now, that said, what are your questions? What time we got? 1:20. All right. We got 10 minutes until classes begin again. Toby. A fencer, it should be 3227A if a fencer has an instructor who understands it, because they can say things that will be familiar. I think it is the most, with proper hand-holding, it's the most coherent single description of anything. The 3 glosses of Lev, Danzig, and Ringek are lesson plans, more or less. They're chunking it out into small digestible bits, whereas 3227A tries to give you big picture, like he tries to give you a whole map of everything and doesn't entirely succeed, but he tries, and the pieces that he gives you are really instructive, but only if you know what you're reading. When I first looked at it in, I don't know, 2002, that would have been like David Lindholm's translation maybe, I was completely baffled and misled. So, for a beginning fencer with no teacher, stay the hell away from 3227A. For a beginning fencer with a good Liechtenauer instructor, that is the best source. Pretty.
Would you say then that it is fair to say that if you're asking the question, what is KDF, 3227A will answer that question. How to KDF, answers that question.
So, I think that you could pick paragraphs out of the Ringek and Lev glosses and assemble them into the preface to 3227A. There's no disagreement conceptually. 3227A is almost purely concept. So as far as explaining how Liechtenauer approaches the fight, 3227A is probably the most comprehensive despite missing some pieces. As far as how to do it, it's not a good source. Then you need to look broadly at all the Liechtenauer sources and pick out things that can be turned into lessons, and that goes into pedagogy and into esoteric subjects of education that I'm not really very good at. But if you just want something you can quote that will encapsulate what Liechtenauer wants you to know, yeah, 3227A. But if you want to actually deep dive and explain something clearly, don't go to 3227A. Other questions? I'll also be around the rest of the day. You can walk up to me and challenge me for more of a dialogue and so forth. All right, I think we need to be done now so we can send you off to other classes. Thank you very much.